Hi, welcome back. Last time I was talking you through how to make finger joints or box joints, and I made this little sample piece to demonstrate the process. Actually, I said I was going to do two corners from a box, and these are the pieces of the box, and I haven't actually had time to do any of those corners yet. So hopefully before the next episode I'll have done that. But today I'm be telling you how to do dovetail joints. Or at least start telling you about dovetail joints, because as you can see here, there are an awful lot of different styles. And in fact, this is just a limited amount. We're going to start with what's called the through dovetail, which is recognisable by the shape of the tails here, like the tails on a bird, and that's called the tail board. The smaller tails going the opposite direction here are called the pins, and they're on what's called the pin board. And in the through dovetail, you can see that the tails and the pins go right the way through the opposing components that are being joined together. Now, if you look at these other ones that I've done, you may just be able to spot some little numbers on them. These were my practice pieces when I first started out in woodworking, and I used to give myself a score for each of the joint lines in the dovetail. So they're all through dovetails. Another set of through dovetails are what's called the decorative ones. So here we've got some houndstooth dovetails, another set there. You can see it's slightly more complicated. We've also got ones where we're connecting pieces which have got odd shapes. So one of my boards here is slightly narrow at one end, so we end up with slightly different shape tails on there. And we've got the half blind dovetail where you can see the tails, but if you turn around to the pin board, you can't see any pins or tails on there at all. There's another example of that. We've also got the obtuse angle dovetails, so connecting pieces at something other than 90 degrees, and it's all pretty similar. And then the bevel dovetails, where the two pieces are sloping in towards each other. I don't know how obvious it is to see that on the camera, but both pieces are sloping inwards as well as joining at 90 degrees. That's probably the most difficult of all of them to set out and cut. What people often think is the most difficult, but it is quite difficult, but not as difficult as the bevel ones, are the secret mitre dovetail, or the totally blind, totally hidden, where the pieces go together and all you see is a mitre line on each corner and a joint line right at the edge. So lots of different dovetails. I'm going to be showing you the through dovetail, which is the first one you should really get to know and practice. Now, when I teach dovetailing to a group, it normally lasts for about 2 hours, the lesson. And well, I'm going to try and do this in a few minutes, so hopefully I'll get most of the main points across. And if you've got any questions, please leave them in the comments and I'll try and get back to you by the next lesson. Okay, so I've got these two pieces nicely prepared. The ends are squared off. Let's just show you that in case you're not familiar with a square. Nice square ends on them, and they're also, the edges are square and the ends are square in that direction. So having prepared your material, you're probably not going to need this square again, but what we will need is a pencil, which you'll think that's quite strange because normally I mark out with a knife, but a sharp pencil for this is fine because we're actually putting lines that we're using to guide ourselves rather than ones that we're going to use as a reference for a chisel. So nice sharp pencil, and it's a soft one as well, so we don't need to dig into the wood too much when we mark it. We'll also need a marking gauge. Well, actually, a wheel marking gauge is fine because it's got a knife edge on it, or a cutting gauge rather than a standard marking gauge because this one's got a knife in it as well. And we're going to be marking across the grain where a knife makes a much nicer mark, whereas a pin on a marking gauge tends to tear the fibres out. Now, a lot of people might tell you that you will need one of my dovetail markers. You don't. They do have advantages. I'll tell you what those are, but you can get away with a square and also a bevel gauge. So why would I suggest a dovetail marking gauge? Well, a decent dovetail marking gauge like these ones will give you both a square and it'll also give you the slope angle for your dovetails all in one tool. So that's why they're handy, that's why I use them. I make mine out of wood, hardwood, because they're used with a pencil or even a pen rather than a knife most of the time. They last really well. What else we need for marking out? I'm going to show you a method where we use some dividers. This is probably the simplest way of marking out without taking any measurements, or without taking any numeric measurements, that is. That's probably all we need. So let's get started with marking out. And I'm going to mark out the tails first, and there's often debate as to whether it's easier to do the pins first or the tails. I generally prefer to do the tails. So that's the method I'm going to be showing you. So the first thing I'm going to do is mark the baseline for the tails and the pins. And this is how far down the piece of wood we're actually going to be cutting them. I'm going to do that with the marking gauge. I'll use the wheel gauge. And the depth I want to mark down, this is going to be my tailboard. The depth I want to go down the tailboard is the thickness of what's going to be the pin board. Because obviously they'll go together and we want the pins to sink in as far as the thickness of the pin board, and the tails to sink in as far as the thickness of the tailboard. And these are both the same thickness, so I can set my gauge from one of them and use it to set both of those baselines. Now we don't have to be too spot on with this. Whichever way you do it, you're going to end up cleaning off the outside of the box with a plane or with a sandpaper. And so if your tails are slightly proud, then you can clean those off with a plane, or if the sides are slightly proud of the tails, you can clean the side off slightly with a plane. But just get it pretty close like so, and then you want to mark all the way round lightly on the, first of all, the tailboard, on the pin board. You don't need to mark the two edges. So we'll put the pin board, actually I put a P on it so we know what it is. That's the pin board, that's the tailboard. They're going to go together like so. We can put the pin board away for a moment. On the tailboard we need to mark out the tails. Now take advantage of the tools you've got. So if you've got a vise, clamp your piece in the vise. As you can see, this is a tailboard. This is the end that the joint's going to be on. If I put it in the vise, it's nice and firm. I can do my marking out. I'm going to be using the dividers on there. I don't have to think about holding that piece. It's not going to move. So how am I going to decide where these tails go on our next board? Well, first thing you could do is just guess. And 90% of the time that'll probably work out fine. Guess for one corner of whatever you're making, and then copy that across all the other corners, and it'll look quite uniform. But not always the best way to do things. What I tend to do is decide the slope of angle I'm going to do. On a softwood I'll probably do a 6-in-1, which is this side of my gauge. Our hardwood probably 8-in-1, which is this side. Now we mark the lines on the tails with the gauge like so. So that's the 6, that's the line I'll be drawing. And as we go across, we can flip the gauge round to do 6-in-1 for both sides of each of the tails. Something that happens when you're doing a dovetail, if I can show you here, let's say that's one of the tails there. There's the tail next to it. That's going to be the waist area. If you suddenly have marked it up, go to your chisels and find you don't have a chisel that's narrow enough to take that piece of waste out. Then you're in real trouble. So, to make sure that doesn't happen, what I do is take my gauge with the right slope, 6 in 1, take the chisel I'm going to use, put the chisel actually onto the gauge line that I've just made on there, so that's the depth it's coming to. Line it up with the edge of the board, move my gauge across, and I'll take that as the end pin. Mark that one in, mark it across the top, and I know that the method I'm going to use is going to make sure that the center pin is wide enough so I can get my chisel in, and I'll show you that now. So let's try and get rid of those marks I've already put on. And we do our marking out or do the dividing on the top of the board, so they're not going to confuse me too much just yet. So I've marked for this pin on this end. Now I'm going to ignore that area completely and just divide the remaining area, so from here across to here, into the number of sections equal to the number of tails I want. I want to have 2 tails on this board, so I want to divide this area here into 2. So my dividers are a little bit too close together at the moment. Keep starting from where that pin line is, a little bit more, and that's it. So I've divided that into 2. I'm going to end up with 2 tails. Now to mark where those tails are, I'm going to start first off right on this edge here. So move the divider across, make a mark, swing it round, make another mark. That'll show where that pin is on that end. Then come from this end here, right on the end, come across, make a mark, swing round, and that should line up with the pin line I've already got. So remembering where those spots are, we've marked them with the pin of the divider, and slip a pencil into that mark, making sure we've got the correct slope, the 6 in 1. Move it up to the pencil, mark across, mark the slope, and then we want to flip the gauge around the other way, pencil in the hole, move the gauge up, mark across, mark down the front, and the final one over here. So pencil in the hole, move the gauge along, mark across the top, and mark down the front. Before we do anything else, let's mark what needs to come away. So this is going to be waste here and here, and then between the 2 tails. Well, that was my erroneous mark. So it's between that line and that line is waste. I'll mark it on the top as well, and I'll mark it down this rear side, which is the side I'm going to be seeing when I actually saw it. And I'll just extend the lines down on this side so I can see what I'm doing. So I've got the equivalent lines, slope lines on this side here. I can see them with my saw. What I can't see very clearly is the baseline. So if I come in and just mark close to the baseline with a pencil to show how far down I want to be sawing. And what you could do here is set up a mirror on the bench in front of your work so that you can see both the lines on this side close to you and also the lines on the other side. And to cut those, I'll take the dovetail saw, and remembering these lines are, they're guides. You don't have to be spot on, But what you do is you set your saw across the top line there, and what I tend to do is start just by setting the teeth in, so very lightly, no weight on the saw at all. So I've just put through enough there just to set the teeth in the wood so that the saw's not going to wobble about like so. And the important point here is that your saw should be perpendicular to the wood. So you can use a square if you like, just to double check that. Next thing you've got to do is tilt it at the correct angle to match the guidelines. You might like to use a little piece of wood here, set it on the plate of the saw, and just tilt the saw until that lines up with the mark. When you've got it like that, you can saw, keeping the saw plate up against that piece of wood. That'll just get you started. But really, once you've got that angle, if you just lock it in, just come down to the gauge line, continue with the other three. Tend to go the ones that are in the same direction, sloping in the same direction, one after the other. So I've set my tooth or teeth, pop that on, line it up, and start. You don't need the block of wood. The important thing is don't try and steer to that line as you're making the cut. Set the angle and stick with that angle. Now we're going in the opposite direction with these ones. So I'll set the saw, eyeball down the line, down to the baseline, and the last one. Set the saw, eyeball the slope, this is quite a pitchy piece of pine. It's grabbing the saw a bit, but it should be fine. And for practicing, don't really worry about what sort of wood you've got. Just make sure you get through a lot of wood, do a lot of cuts, and you'll get really good at that. Cutting these ends off, I think you can see it's relatively easy. We're going to get the saw in from the side to cut those two bits of waste out. But it's this part in the middle between the tails we can't get a normal saw to. But we could use a jeweler's saw, fret saw, even a coping saw in some cases. Come down this slope, work the saw, turn it around and cut across, and we can go across very close to the baseline. So that's one method of getting up close to the baseline. The other method is chopping, and I'll show you that now. In order to chop the waste away between the tails, clamp the work down over the leg of a bench, find your chisel, and there we go. And the immediate thought is, well, let's put the chisel into that gauge line there. That's where we want to cut it, and let's just chop down. If you do that, the bevel on the chisel is going to push the chisel back into the area we don't want to cut, and you're going to find that it gets crushed, and that's one of the problems that I'll show you in another video. So what we're going to do is start a reasonable way in from that line. Just make a slight cut, and then just take that out with the chisel as though you were making a knife wall. Then extend that a little bit deeper. Now we've got some material already wasted away now, so we can creep back with our chisel towards that line, taking a little bit at a time. And because there's nothing on the bevel side of the chisel, it's not going to force it back further than the gauge line. So I'm now within about 1/2 mil of that gauge line. So now I feel quite confident that I could put my chisel in there. But that line's not very deep. We didn't do them very deep in the first place. So what we can do is use square and a knife just to reinforce in the areas that we're going to be taking the waste away. So at that end there, up to the tail, just deepen that a little bit. This area here, and over at this end. We don't want to mark across the actual tails themselves too deeply, because that's just something we're going to have to remove later on when we clean the thing up. I can drop that into the knife line. Be fairly confident that the chisel's not going to jump back into the work we want. So that's given a nice clean line at the base of that waste. And if we just deepen that slot, like so, as we go deeper we can hammer slightly heavier. You see, I'm just removing the waste so that there's nothing for my bevel to ride up against and push the chisel back. So I reckon I'm halfway through. I can flip that board over now, work from the other side, and eventually that little piece of waste will become free. So we'll remove a little bit away from the line. And then work back towards that line. And I can sit that in the knife line now. Take that waste away, gradually digging down deeper and deeper. And you see that piece of waste is now free. We push it back in. We should be able to lift it out. And there's just a little bit of tidying up to do in there, which we can attempt to do some of that now. Don't chop all the way through. I always want to come from both sides. And actually undercutting on these is quite good, because it means there's never any chance of binding up when you're trying to put the piece together. So having done that, we'll cut these edge pieces away. So back in the vise, be good to reinforce those knife lines. Use a chisel just to make a little knife wall, like so. Take your saw, and maybe you haven't gone quite deep enough when you've been cutting this way. So just gradually go in. You don't want to overcook either line. There we go. Invariably, because you've sawn it, there'll be a little bit of cleanup to do. You can put your chisel onto the knife line, the knife wall. Run that down into the corner. But usually it's pretty good. Same on the other side. just want to clean up right into the corner so it's nice and sharp. And if you're pushing the chisel this way along with the grain, it's really with just very little pressure, otherwise you could split the wood. And any final cleanup, if you put it in the vise like so, you can then use the chisel, sit on the knife line, if there's any knife line left, and just clean up by pairing across those joint surfaces. Flip that over. Feel for the knife line. If you tilt the chisel slightly, angle it slightly, you can get right up into the corner there. Apologise for the squeaking, I'm sitting on a stool. I should be standing at my higher bench, but it's difficult to film there. Okay, well I'm happy, that's nice and clean. Things to watch out for at this point are that none of those surfaces, joint surfaces, are higher than the gauge line. So use a square on there just to make sure it sits nicely, it's not rocking at all. Check all those out, make any adjustments that are necessary, but basically that's it. You've got your tails cut, we're ready to do the pins. Now the normal trick employed for marking out the pins is to use a plane on its side and use the vise as well. We'll set the pin board, this board here. Well, it's just, that corner is going to go together like this, I think you can see. So keeping it in that orientation, turn it around, put the pin board in the vise and put it down at the same height as the plane. Like so. Move the plane back and lift the tail board on top of the pin board. Line up the two edges. If you use the large stock on a square, just put that on there, that'll help you line up one edge. And what you want to have is barely, a little bit of light, barely visible along the joint line at the bottom of your tails. If you're having trouble, get yourself a piece of white paper, put that down on the bench underneath. That'll help to reflect the light a lot better. So you can see the barest amount of light just coming through that joint there. Everything's squared up nicely. So if I put some pressure on top of the tailboard, stop anything moving, and get in there with a sharp pencil and mark for the pins. And something important here is the fact that all of this pencil line is what we want to save. We don't want to cut that pencil line away, otherwise the joint's going to be too slack. If I use the square now to mark down straight lines from where those lines are on the top. Often said that if you know what straight is, what plumb is when you cut, you shouldn't need to put those lines in. Pop that back in the vise. Now these lines, as opposed to the tails which were angled, these need to be perfectly plumb, so often quite an advantage to make sure that your tailboard is perfectly plumb in the vise. So we've got the slope across the top of the pin here, got that set. Now we just want to follow this line down here, leaving it. And level the saw out. And the same with the other three. Always trying to remember which side of the line you want to be on. And in fact, I should have marked my waist before I started. So try and remember that yourself. There we go. Now on this occasion, we're removing quite a lot of material, and my preferred method actually for removing material is to use a jeweler's saw. So we'll drop that down, and I'll just, with it moving but not at the bottom of the cut, I'll start to turn it round. So it's now cutting horizontally. Now I'll just make my way across. And bear in mind that because of the angles on the top there, we'll need to change the position of this saw so we don't cut in areas we don't want to cut. So I'm bringing the handle round now to match the angle I want to finish with. I clamp it again on the bench top, and now you want a chisel which is almost as wide as the narrowest part of the gap between the pins. I actually saw them quite close there. In fact, I probably saw them close enough to be able to chop right on those lines. I normally leave enough so that I can gradually work my way back. In fact, there maybe I should come down first of all. Just pare a little bit away. Now I think I'm close enough. And if you find that that line, that gauge line isn't as deep as you might like to rest your chisel in, again you can reinforce that with the knife. And if you set the chisel in the middle, then no matter what happens, you shouldn't cause any problem on the far side. About halfway down. If you've got a wide chisel, you should find that what's left to do is easy enough just to pare. Finish off from the other side. And of course from this side now, that's why we need the chisel that's as narrow as this one is, because it needs to fit through this gap. Because this was the far side, I angle my jeweler's saw slightly up on the far side just to make sure I have no chance of getting too close to the knife line. So there's a little bit more to remove. And although I can barely see them, I bet you can't see this knife line at all, so I'll just pop that in. My chisel will sit in there nicely. Once you get to that point, I would put it vertically in the vise just to give a final clean up before we're ready to assemble. At this point, I'll come back probably with a smaller chisel. Just cleaning those corners up. Maybe didn't quite saw far enough down there. So just get any muck out. Now the way we sawed, or we've sawn, now the way we've sawn up to the line but not taking any of the line away means that this is probably going to be quite snug fit. Just clear some of these little tags away. I just find this is much nicer if you're working on a hardwood. So just checking we've got it the right way round. Try the tails on there. That's a lovely fit. Super. Well, hopefully you can see we've got good tight joints. We can still separate it, so if I can do that by hand, then I know I can put glue on and reassemble it, even if I need to tap it a little bit with a mallet. So I'm happy with that. I shall glue that up. We'll come back, we'll clean off the marking out, that very slight gauge line we put in, clean all that off with a plane, and we should see a nice dovetail joint. So this is the tailboard side. I'll just clean that off. Planing direction is away from the joint, which means I shouldn't have any breakout from the ends or from the end grain of the pins. I just want to take enough off to get rid of the gauge mark that I made and also the pencil mark where I did those demonstrations. So that's gone. Let's swap over to a smoother. Super. Now, for the pin board, the planing direction again is away from the joint. That's lucky, Just makes it a little bit easier. Now it's just bringing the tails down flush with the pin board. There we go. So there you have it, the through dovetail joint. It really isn't too complicated, but it does take practice to get it to look nice like this one. So do some practice, get yourself a piece of wood, flatten it, square it, thickness it, and then start making joints. Make a joint like this, cut it off here, make it again, do that half a dozen times, and you really should be seeing some progress.